Welcome! In this video, I'll be covering the first part of yeast breads in Chapter 32 of your On Cooking textbook. There are two main types of yeast breads, lean doughs and rich doughs. Lean doughs, such as your French baguettes here, have very few ingredients: flour, water, salt, and yeast. Items like your soft rolls or your milk rolls might have a few other ingredients, but not a substantial amount of fat. The rich doughs then can be divided into enriched, meaning the fat is incorporated throughout the dough, or laminated doughs, meaning that your fat is folded into layers. At the bottom here you have a croissant, made with croissant dough, which is a laminated dough, as well as you have either your puff pastry or Danish dough here. This is an example of both your challah and your brioche, which are your enriched doughs. In all yeast doughs, the main leavening agent is going to be yeast. So we'll spend a little time talking about yeast. Yeast is a product that acts and eats the sugars that are within your product, found naturally in your flours, and produces alcohol and carbon dioxide gas, which helps your product to rise. Moisture activates most of the yeast, as you'll find a lot of dry yeast products. However, there is fresh available. We'll talk about that in a moment. It's important to note salt when we're talking about yeast. Salt does help to strengthen the gluten and condition that, but salt will stop the yeast from being activated, from it growing, from it eating and giving off those gases. So it's important to make sure that the salt doesn't come right into contact with the yeast, but yet you want salt in there to control the amount of gases that yeast can actually expel. It's important to note the temperatures. Where yeast is activated, where yeast is killed. So yeast is inactive in a dormant stage at 34 degrees Fahrenheit. It starts a slow fermentation as your doughs begin to be made, and that yeast is at a 60 to 70 degree temperature. The ideal temperature, though, is around that 80 to 90 degree mark. So every time you'll hear about softening or rehydrating your yeast, the idea is that you have it in water that is just slightly above that 80 to 90 degree temperature to really get that yeast activated. Fermentation then starts to slow above 105 degrees, and yeast dies at 138. So it's extremely important, if you're putting your products in a proof box, that proof box does not reach a temperature over 138 degrees. There are three main types that we use in reference to baked goods. However, at the bottom here you'll see there is a brewer's yeast. This brewer's yeast still carries the name of a yeast, but it is nutritional. It really has no leavening power whatsoever. It again just adds nutrition to your baked goods. So we'll start with your compressed yeast. Compressed yeast found over here on the top. This is your fresh yeast. It's 70% moisture and it must be kept refrigerated. It says here that it has a shelf life of 2 to 3 weeks as long as it is properly stored, wrapped in an airtight packaging. It will stay good. You're looking for it to be creamy white and crumbly with just a mild yeast odor. If you find that it is sour or slimy, brown, a darker brown color, it has gone bad. It's past its shelf life. This yeast you can add directly into your products. It does not need to be rehydrated, does not need any prior work done to it. Active dry yeast then, which you'll see in the middle here. You'll notice these are little granules. They almost remind me of, little mustard seeds or little millet seeds. All the water has been removed by hot air. It must be refrigerated after opening because it is still a live product there. You must soften it, though, in order to rehydrate it before you can add it right to your products. Then we have instant yeast. Instant yeast down here on the bottom, you can see, is more flake-like. Actually, let's take this to being like white peppercorns and then ground white pepper, if we want to compare the two. The instant yeast is very, very fine, very individual little granules that can be added directly to your dough without having to rehydrate them. However, most chefs definitely prefer to rehydrate the instant yeast before they add it into their dough. If you have a recipe that specifies active dry yeast, but you only have fresh or instant yeast, let's look at these products here. Compare them to, let's say, herbs. So you have fresh herbs. They're full of flavor, and you measure out, let's say, a tablespoon of chopped basil. Now you take and compare that to dried basil. You would need about half the amount because it's twice as concentrated for that dried basil. Now let's take ground basil. If we went and ground it and made it even finer, made it even more pungent, would a teaspoon be enough and equivalent? We would have kind of a 3 times the concentrate there. So obviously we're not talking about herbs, but just to give you an analogy. So for yeast, when you have fresh yeast versus active dry is twice as condensed, and instant then is 3 times as condensed. So I have some measurements here for you, but in all honesty, I would look at your package, and there generally is going to be conversions included in that package for that specific brand of yeast. There is natural yeast found everywhere, just naturally through the air in the spores, as well as you can purchase actual starters. Natural products will have the yeast, such as grapes. That's how wine is made. The yeast that's found in the grape skins then are what is allowed to ferment, and it's added with some sugars in order for it to consume that and give off those gases. The carbon dioxide comes out of the container, whereas the alcohol will stay inside. That again is just a basic process of making wine and fermentation. So grape skins are great, apple peels are great, orange rinds, potatoes. These are products that you could let sit and naturally start to ferment. However, most will just make a basic starter by taking your yeast, taking water, and flour, mixing that together, and that is providing the sugars that yeast needs in order to consume and start giving off those gases. So you'll notice here on the right I have a picture. This is day 1. I started a starter here, and then on the second day you'll notice not a whole lot of change, maybe a little bit if I want to really say something. The second day, or the third day then, you'll notice it's starting to get pretty foamy up here. That's all those gases being given off. Now ideally, if this was something I was going to store for a week at a time, I would sprinkle flour right on the top. That way that starter can just eat as much as it wants throughout the time period. You'll notice here it looks like on the 4th day, it had come up so high and then kind of just deflated. You'll notice this kind of slime here is really just a liquid, a very soury smelling liquid that forms. And then on the bottom, you'll notice again it keeps growing, and that slime layer gets a little bit more pronounced on the top. At this point, it has started to eat the majority of the sugars and is really starting to develop that soury flavor from that alcohol that's left inside that starter. So again, if I was going to store it in our cooler for a week or 2 at a time, I would mix the starter, then sprinkle flour on top, cover it well with plastic wrap, and store it in the cooler. Every 2 weeks or so, I would stir it and then add more flour to keep it going. In our next section, we'll talk about actually making the yeast doughs and the 12 steps that are required. Thank you.